They've been controlling you your entire life, and you didn't even notice, not with chains or threats, but with something far more subtle, far more powerful, invisible forces buried so deep in your psychology that you think your choices are your own, your beliefs are your own, your reactions are your own, but they're not. You've been programmed, shaped, and influenced by mechanisms that operate in the shadows of your mind, pulling strings you can't see, pushing buttons you didn't know existed. And the scary part? It's been working perfectly. Every time you scrolled past something that made you uncomfortable, every time you stayed silent when you wanted to speak up, every time you bought something you didn't need, believed something without questioning it, or followed the crowd even when it got told you not to, that wasn't weakness. That wasn't coincidence. That was social psychology doing exactly what it was designed to do, control behavior, without you ever realizing you were being controlled. Right now, as you listen to this, your brain is running programs it didn't write, following rules it didn't choose, and protecting beliefs that were planted in you by people, systems, and experiences you've long forgotten. And the only way to break free is to see the game for what it is, to understand the invisible architecture of influence that shapes every decision you make, every relationship you form, and every identity you build. This isn't a book about understanding other people. This is a book about understanding yourself, about seeing the puppet strings attached to your mind and finally cutting them, one by one, until you're no longer reacting unconsciously, but choosing consciously, no longer being manipulated, but creating your own path, and no longer living the life you were programmed to live, but the life you actually want. What you're about to hear will disturb you, challenge you, and maybe even make you question everything you thought you knew about yourself. But if you make it to the end, you'll walk away with something most people never get. The truth about how your mind really works, the awareness to see when you're being influenced, and the power to take back control. So here's the question. Are you ready to see what's been hidden from you? Are you ready to understand the psychology behind every choice you've ever made? Are you ready to stop being a passive player in your own life and start becoming the person who's actually in control? If the answer is yes, then keep listening, because what comes next will change the way you see yourself, other people, and the entire world around you forever. Let's begin. People don't react to reality. They react to their interpretation. People don't react to reality. They react to their interpretation of it. And this is one of the most fundamental truths in understanding human behavior. Think about it for a moment. Two people can witness the exact same event, be in the same room, hear the same words, and yet walk away with completely different stories in their minds. One person might feel attacked, while the other feels inspired. One might remember anger, while the other remembers kindness. This isn't because reality changed. It's because each person filtered that reality through their own lens of past experiences, beliefs, fears, and expectations. Human behavior is driven far less by what actually happens, and much more by what people believe is happening. Your brain doesn't record events like a camera. It interprets them like a storyteller, filling in gaps, assigning meaning, and coloring everything with emotion. This is why two siblings can grow up in the same household and have completely different memories of their childhood. One remembers safety and love. The other remembers tension and neglect. Both are telling their truth, because both are describing their interpretation, not just the facts. Social psychology begins at this exact point, where perception takes over facts. It's the space between what happened and what we think happened, and that space is where all human conflict, connection, misunderstanding, and meaning lives. When someone misunderstands your intentions, they're not reacting to what you meant. They're reacting to what they heard, what they assumed, and what their past taught them to expect. When a compliment is taken as an insult, or silence is read as rejection, it's interpretation doing the work, not reality. This is why logic alone rarely wins arguments, because you're not arguing against facts. You're arguing against someone's deeply held interpretation of those facts, and that interpretation feels just as real to them as any truth you could present. Once you understand this, you stop being confused by why people act the way they do. You realize that everyone is living in their own version of the world, and your job isn't always to correct their version. It's to understand it, and sometimes to gently help them see things from a different angle. But forced change never works, because interpretation is personal, emotional, and protected by the ego. People defend their perception of reality even more fiercely than reality itself, because their perception is tied to their identity, their sense of safety, and their need to make sense of a chaotic world. So if you want to influence someone, connect with someone, or even just be understood by someone, you have to start by recognizing that they're not seeing what you're seeing. They're seeing what their mind has constructed, and that construction is just as real to them as anything you could ever say. The need to belong is stronger than the need to be right. Deep down, beneath all the logic, education, and independence we pride ourselves on, there's a primal force that drives human behavior more powerfully than almost anything else: the need to belong. This need is so strong, so deeply wired into our psychology, that most people will silently agree with the group rather than speak the truth, even when they know the group is wrong. It's not weakness, it's survival instinct dressed in modern clothing. For thousands of years, being cast out of the tribe meant death. No protection, no resources, no chance of survival. So the brain learned to prioritize acceptance over accuracy, connection over correctness, and fitting in over standing out. Even today, in a world where being alone won't kill you, that ancient wiring still runs the show. Acceptance feels safer than honesty, and that feeling overrides rational thinking almost every single time. This is why you see people laughing at jokes they don't find funny, nodding along in meetings when they disagree, staying quiet when someone says something offensive, or going along with plans they don't actually want to follow. It's not that they're fake or spineless. It's that their brain is calculating risk in real time, and the risk of rejection feels more dangerous than the cost of silence. This explains so much about human behavior that seems irrational on the surface. It explains why trends go viral even when they're ridiculous, why bad decisions spread through organizations like wildfire, why entire communities can believe things that are obviously false, and why social pressure often overrides logic, evidence, and personal values. When everyone around you is doing something, wearing something, believing something, or saying something, your brain interprets that as a signal. This is what's safe. This is what's accepted. This is how you stay in the group. And the fear of being the outsider, the one who questions, the one who disrupts a harmony, is so uncomfortable that most people would rather betray their own thoughts than risk that feeling. You see this everywhere. In schools, where kids bully others just to stay on the right side of the popular group. In workplaces, where employees stay silent about unethical practices because speaking up could cost them their career. In families, where people pretend to agree with toxic beliefs just to keep the peace. And even in friendships, where someone goes along with activities they hate because saying no feels like social suicide. The need to belong doesn't just influence small decisions. It shapes identities, careers, relationships, and entire life paths. People choose majors they don't care about because their parents or peers expect it. They stay in relationships that make them miserable because being alone feels worse. They adopt political views, religious beliefs, and lifestyle choices not because they've thought them through, but because those views come with community, and that community offers something the isolated truth never can: connection. And here's the deeper layer. This need to belong doesn't just make people follow the group, it makes them defend the group, even against their own interests. Once someone has invested their identity into being part of something, a company, a movement, a social circle, they'll protect that group's reputation as fiercely as they protect themselves, because in their mind, they are the group. Criticizing the group feels like self-betrayal. This is why people stay loyal to organizations that exploit them, why they defend leaders who clearly don't care about them, and why they attack outsiders who threaten the group's cohesion. The need to belong is so strong that it can make good people do bad things. Smart people believe lies, and independent thinkers surrender their voice. It's not about stupidity or lack of awareness. It's about the brain prioritizing emotional safety over intellectual integrity. And until you recognize this force in yourself and others, you'll keep being confused by why people act against their own beliefs, why movements gain momentum despite being harmful, and why loneliness is considered one of the most painful human experiences. Because at the end of the day, humans are social creatures, and the need to be part of something will almost always win over the need to be right. First impressions are mental shortcuts, not truth. Your brain makes decisions about people faster than you can consciously think, and those decisions shape everything that comes after, within just a few seconds of meeting someone. Sometimes even before a single word is spoken, your brain has already labeled them as safe, important, or irrelevant, and this happens so quickly and so automatically that you don't even realize it happening. You might think you're being open-minded, fair, and rational, but beneath your awareness, Your brain is running an ancient program designed not for accuracy, but for speed. These snap judgments are survival tools, not truth, and they were never meant to be. Thousands of years ago, when humans lived in dangerous environments filled with predators and rival tribes, the ability to instantly assess whether a stranger was a threat or an ally could mean the difference between life and death. There was no time for careful analysis, no luxury of getting to know someone slowly. Your brain had to decide fast, and it used whatever information was available: body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, clothing, posture, eye contact, and even subtle things like smell and energy. If someone looked aggressive, your brain labeled them as dangerous and triggered a fear response. If someone seemed weak or unimportant, your brain dismissed them to save energy for more pressing concerns. If someone appeared confident, well-dressed, or high status, your brain flagged them as important and worthy of attention. This system kept our ancestors alive, but in the modern world, it creates massive distortions in how we see and treat each other. The problem is that once a first impression is formed, it becomes a lens through which all future information is filtered, and this lens is incredibly hard to remove, even with evidence that contradicts it. Psychologists call this confirmation bias, and it means that once your brain decides someone is untrustworthy, lazy, arrogant, or boring, it will unconsciously look for information that supports that label and ignore or downplay information that challenges it. If you meet someone and immediately feel they're cold or unfriendly, you'll interpret their neutral face as hostility, their silence as arrogance, and their politeness as fake. But if your first impression is positive, that same neutral face becomes thoughtful, that same silence becomes mysterious, and that same politeness becomes genuine warmth. The facts didn't change. Your interpretation did, and that interpretation was set in the first few seconds. This is why job interviews are so heavily influenced by the first 30 seconds, why dating apps succeed or fail based on a single photo, why teachers often predict a student's success based on early behavior, and why someone who makes a bad first impression at work can spend years trying to shake that label, even after proving themselves again and again. People don't see you as you are. They see you as their first impression told them you are, and every interaction after that is just their brain trying to confirm what it already decided. It's also why appearance matters so much, even though we're told not to judge a book by its cover. The truth is, everyone judges a cover, because a cover is all the brain has in those critical first seconds. Clean clothes signal competence and respect. Good posture signals confidence. Eye contact signals honesty and engagement. A warm smile signals safety and friendliness. These signals may have nothing to do with who you actually are, but they shape how people treat you, what opportunities you're given, and whether you're even given a chance to show your real self. And here's the most frustrating part. Even when people are presented with clear evidence that their first impression was wrong, they resist changing it. If someone thinks you're unreliable based on one late arrival, being on time for the next 10 meetings won't erase that label. It'll just be seen as an exception, or they'll find another flaw to focus on. The brain doesn't like admitting it was wrong, because changing a judgment requires effort, and the brain is wired to conserve energy. It's easier to keep the original label and twist new information to fit it than to rebuild your entire perception of someone from scratch. This is why reputations are so powerful and so fragile. One bad moment can define you for years, while one good moment might be forgotten by tomorrow. It's not fair, it's not logical, but it's how the human mind works. So, if you want to be seen accurately, you have to manage that first impression carefully. Because once it's set, you're no longer in control of how people see you. Their brain is. And if you want to see others more clearly, you have to consciously fight your own snap judgments. Remind yourself that first impressions are guesses, not facts, and give people the space to show you who they really are beyond those first few seconds. Because the truth is, nobody is just one moment, one look, or one interaction. But that's often all the brain needs to decide. Confidence is often mistaken for competence. One of the most dangerous illusions in human psychology is the automatic equation of confidence with competence. And it happens so naturally, so effortlessly, that most people never even question it. People don't always follow the smartest person in the room. They follow the one who sounds sure, the one who speaks without hesitation, the one who carries themselves like they already know the answer. It doesn't matter if that person is actually right or if their ideas are deeply flawed. What matters is how they deliver those ideas, because confidence signals safety to the brain, and safety is what people crave more than truth. When someone speaks with certainty, your brain interprets that certainty as evidence of knowledge, experience, and reliability, even when there's no logical reason to make that connection. This is why strong speakers can influence crowds even when they're completely wrong, why charismatic leaders can build movement around bad ideas, and why quiet, knowledgeable people are often overlooked in favor of loud, confident ones. The brain is wired to follow confidence because, in ancient times, hesitation could be deadly. If the tribe leader hesitated while being chased by a predator, everyone died. But if they acted decisively, even if the decision wasn't perfect, at least there was a plan and a direction. Confidence wasn't about being right. It was about reducing uncertainty, and uncertainty is one of the most uncomfortable states for the human brain. We are hardwired to prefer a clear, confident wrong answer over a hesitant, uncertain right one, because a confident answer gives us something to hold on to, a sense of direction, a feeling that someone is in control. This is why in meetings, the person who speaks first and most boldly often sets the agenda, even if someone else in the room has better ideas, but speaks more carefully. This is why in debates, the person who sounds more certain often wins the audience, even if their arguments fall apart under scrutiny. This is why in classrooms, confident students are assumed to be smarter, even when quiet students score higher on tests. And this is why in relationships, the partner who expresses their feelings with conviction is often believed over the one who second-guesses themselves, even when the second-guesser is being more honest and thoughtful. Confidence creates a kind of social gravity. It pulls people in, makes them listen, makes them trust, and makes them follow. But here's the trap. Confidence and competence are not the same thing, and in many cases, they're actually inversely related. The Dunning-Kruger effect shows that people with the least knowledge in a subject often have the most confidence, because they don't know enough to understand how much they don't know. Experts, on the other hand, tend to be more cautious, more aware of nuance, more willing to say, "I'm not sure," or "it depends," and that hesitation makes them seem less trustworthy to people who are looking for certainty. So society ends up being led by people who are confident but wrong, while the people who are knowledgeable but careful get ignored, doubted, or sidelined. You see this everywhere. Politicians who have no policy experience but speak with absolute certainty win elections over experienced leaders who acknowledge complexity. Business people who pitch ideas with unshakable confidence attract investors, even when their business model is unrealistic. Social media influencers who speak boldly about topics they barely understand gain millions of followers, while actual experts with decades of experience struggle to get attention because they speak in careful, qualified terms. This dynamic doesn't just affect who we follow. It affects who gets hired, who gets promoted, who gets believed, and who gets ignored. In job interviews, candidates who exude confidence are seen as leadership material, even if they lack the skills, while capable candidates who show humility or admit what they don't know are seen as weak or unprepared. In classrooms, students who raise their hand quickly and speak boldly are seen as smarter, while students who think before they speak are seen as unsure. In friendships and families, the person who speaks with the most certainty about what's right or wrong becomes a moral authority, even if their reasoning is shallow. And because confidence is so persuasive, even the confident person starts to believe their own certainty. They mistake their ability to sound sure for actual understanding, and this creates a feedback loop where confidence breeds more confidence, regardless of competence. The scary part is that this illusion doesn't just fool others, it fools a confident person too. When someone is rewarded again and again for speaking boldly, they stop questioning themselves, stop learning, stop seeking feedback. Because why would they? The world keeps telling them they're right, keeps giving them platforms, followers, promotions, and influence. Meanwhile, the competent but humble person keeps doubting themselves, keeps second-guessing, keeps thinking they need to know more before they speak up, and they end up silenced not because they lack value, but because they lack performance or certainty. So what do you do with this knowledge? If you're someone who values truth and competence, you have to train yourself to look past the confidence and ask deeper questions. What's the evidence? What do they actually know? Are they open to being wrong? Do they listen or do they just talk? And if you're someone who struggles with confidence, understand that you don't have to become arrogant or fake certainty. You just have to learn to present your knowledge in a way that doesn't apologize for itself, because the world won't always dig deep enough to see your competence if you don't give a confident surface to grab onto. Confidence is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or for harm. But either way, it's one of the most powerful forces in human influence, and pretending it doesn't matter is just another way of letting the loudest voice win. Most decisions are emotional. Logic comes later. We like to think of ourselves as rational beings who carefully weigh facts, analyze options, and make logical decisions based on evidence and reason. But the truth is far more humbling and far more human. Most decisions are emotional, and logic comes later, not as a driver, but as a storyteller that makes sense of what we've already chosen to do. Humans decide emotionally and justify logically, and this happens so seamlessly, so unconsciously, that we genuinely believe we're being rational even when we're not. Whether it's buying a product, trusting a person, choosing a belief, picking a career, falling in love, or even something as simple as deciding what to eat for dinner, emotions make the call first, and logic is often just the explanation we give afterward to make ourselves and others feel like we had good reasons. This is not a flaw or a weakness. It's how the brain is designed. The emotional centers of the brain, particularly the limbic system, process information faster than the rational, analytical prefrontal cortex, which means that by the time you're consciously thinking about a decision, your emotions have already pushed you toward a choice, and now your logical mind is just playing catch-up, gathering evidence that supports what you already feel. Think about the last time you bought something you didn't really need. Maybe it was a pair of shoes, a gadget, a book, or a subscription service. If you're honest with yourself, the decision to buy it happened in an instant, triggered by a feeling, excitement, curiosity, fear of missing out, a desire to feel good, or even just boredom. But after you bought it, your mind immediately started building a case. I needed this because it's practical, or this was on sale, so it's actually a smart financial move, or this will improve my life in some way. The emotion made the decision. The logic just made you feel better about it. The same pattern plays out in nearly every area of life. When you meet someone new and instantly like them or distrust them, that's emotion. The reasons you come up with later, they seem honest, or something about them feels off, are just your brain's way of explaining a gut reaction that happened in seconds. When you choose to believe a news story, a political idea, or a piece of advice, emotion decides first. Does this align with what I already feel? Does this make me feel safe, validated, or empowered? Does this threaten my identity or worldview? If the answer makes you feel good or confirms what you want to believe, you accept it. And then you look for facts, statistics, or expert opinions that back it up. If it makes you uncomfortable or challenges your beliefs, you reject it. And then you find reasons why it's wrong, biased, or irrelevant. This is why two people can look at the exact same evidence and come to completely opposite conclusions. They're not actually analyzing the evidence objectively. They're filtering it through their emotions and then using logic to justify the emotional stance they've already taken. This emotional first decision-making shows up powerfully in relationships. People fall in love not because they've logically assessed compatibility, shared values, and long-term potential. They fall in love because of how someone makes them feel, and then they create a narrative to justify it. We have so much in common, or they really understand me, even when the evidence might suggest otherwise. And when relationships fall apart, people stay far longer than logic would recommend, not because they're stupid, but because emotional attachment overrides all rational arguments for leaving. The heart decides, and the mind scrambles to defend that decision, often for years. The same is true for careers. Most people don't choose their jobs based purely on salary, benefits, or logical career progression. They choose based on how a job makes them feel. Does it give them status? Does it make them feel important, creative, secure, or free? Does it align with their identity or the identity they want to have? Someone might turn down a high-paying job because it doesn't feel right, and then justify it by saying the commute was too long or the company culture wasn't fit. But the real reason was emotional. It just didn't resonate with who they felt they were or wanted to be. And someone else might stay in a job they hate, not because it's logical, but because leaving feels scary, uncertain, or like admitting failure. And those emotions are powerful enough to override years of misery. This emotional decision-making is also why marketing and advertising work so well. Companies don't sell products by listing features and specifications. They sell feelings. A car commercial doesn't just tell you about fuel efficiency and safety ratings. It shows you freedom, adventure, status, family joy, or power, because those emotions drive the decision to buy. A perfume ad doesn't explain the chemical composition. It sells romance, confidence, mystery, or elegance. Once the emotion is triggered, your logical mind takes over and finds practical reasons to justify the purchase. I need a reliable car, or this scent is long-lasting. But the truth is, you were sold the moment you felt something. Even in politics, voting decisions are driven far more by emotion than policy analysis. People vote for candidates who make them feel heard, safe, proud, or hopeful, and then they justify their vote by pointing to policies, track records, or party affiliation. But if you dig deeper, the emotional connection came first. The feeling that this person understands me, represents me, or will fight for me, and the logical reasons were built around that feeling. This is why fact-checking rarely changes minds in political debates. You're not arguing against logic. You're arguing against emotion. And emotion doesn't respond to facts. It responds to feelings of safety, identity, and belonging. The tricky part is that this process is almost entirely invisible to us. We genuinely believe we're making rational choices because the logical justification feels so real, so solid, so well-constructed. But it's a story we tell ourselves after the decision has already been made. And that story is designed not to reflect truth, but to protect our self-image as rational, intelligent, thoughtful people. Admitting that we decided something because it felt good, or because we were afraid, or because we want to belong, feels uncomfortable, even childish. So we dress it up in logic and present it as reason. But here's the empowering part. Once you understand this about yourself and others, you stop being so confused by human behavior. You stop wondering why people make choices that seem irrational or self-destructive, because you realize they're not operating from logic. They're operating from emotion, and emotion has its own logic, its own priorities, its own sense of what matters. And if you want to influence someone, persuade someone, or connect with someone, you can't just throw facts at them and expect change. You have to speak to their emotions first, help them feel something different, and only then will their logical mind be willing to follow. Because at the end of the day, we are not thinking machines that occasionally feel. We are feeling machines that occasionally think. And the sooner we accept that, the more honest and effective we become in navigating our own decisions and understanding the decisions of everyone around us. Social proof controls more than we admit. There's a quiet, invisible force shaping almost every decision you make, every opinion you hold, and every action you take, and most of the time you don't even realize it's there. It's called social proof. It controls human behavior far more powerfully than we're willing to admit. When people are unsure about what to do, what to think, or how to feel, they don't stop and analyze the situation independently. They look around at what everyone else is doing, and they follow that lead, because the brain has a simple, ancient rule hardwired into it. If many people believe it, it must be safe, and if many people are doing it, it must be the right thing to do. This isn't conscious reasoning. It's an automatic survival shortcut that helped our ancestors stay alive. If you were in an unfamiliar environment and suddenly everyone around you started running, you didn't stop to ask why. You ran too, because hesitation could get you killed. If the group avoided a certain area, you avoided it too, because the group's behavior carried information that you didn't have time to verify yourself. Social proof was a way to borrow the wisdom, experience, and instinct of the crowd without having to learn everything from scratch, and in many cases, it kept people alive. But in the modern world, this same instinct doesn't protect us. It manipulates us, and it does so constantly, in ways big and small, obvious and subtle. Reviews, likes, followers, crowds, trends, bestseller lists, viral videos, packed restaurants, long lines, celebrity endorsements, expert recommendations. All of these are forms of social proof, and they don't just influence behavior, they validate it. When you see a product with thousands of 5-star reviews, your brain doesn't carefully read through each review to assess credibility. It sees a number and feels safe. When you see a post with millions of likes, you assume it must be valuable, true, or worth your attention, even if you haven't evaluated the content itself. When you see a crowd gathered somewhere, you feel the pull to join, not because you know what's happening, but because the presence of others signals that something important or worthwhile is going on. The brain interprets popularity as proof of quality, truth, or correctness, and this interpretation happens faster than conscious thought. This is why restaurants with long lines seem more desirable than empty ones, even if the food is identical. This is why books that become bestsellers sell even more copies. Not because they're necessarily better, but because the bestseller label itself becomes social proof that makes more people want to read them. This is why fashion trends sweep through entire populations, even when the clothes aren't practical or flattering. People see others wearing something, and that visibility alone makes it feel right, acceptable, and desirable. Social proof creates a self-reinforcing cycle. The more people do something, the more others want to do it, which makes even more people do it, until a behavior, belief, or trend reaches a tipping point where it feels almost mandatory, and going against it feels like social suicide. This dynamic doesn't just apply to consumer choices. It shapes beliefs, values, and identities. When you grow up in a community where everyone shares the same political views, religious beliefs, or cultural practices, those views don't feel like opinions. They feel like facts because everyone around you validates them. The brain assumes that if this many people believe something, there must be a good reason, even if you've never personally examined that reason. This is why people raised in different environments can have completely opposite views on the same topic, and each side genuinely believe they're right, and the other is deluded. They're both relying on the social proof of their own communities, and both communities are convinced that their consensus equals truth. Social proof also explains why misinformation spreads so quickly and why it's so hard to correct. Once a false claim gains enough traction, once enough people repeat it, share it, and believe it, it becomes socially validated, and at that point, debunking it with facts feels like fighting against a crowd, which is something the brain resists instinctively. People would rather be wrong with a group than right alone, because being alone feels dangerous, even when the group is clearly heading in the wrong direction. This is why conspiracies, myths, and harmful ideas can persist for generations. They're not sustained by evidence. They're sustained by social proof, by the sheer number of people who believe and repeat them. And here's where it gets even more insidious. Social proof doesn't require real consensus. It can be manufactured, manipulated, and faked. Marketers know this, which is why they use tactics like fake reviews, paid influencers, inflated follower counts, staged testimonials, and bot-generated engagement to create the illusion of popularity. Once that illusion exists, real people start to follow because they can't tell the difference between genuine social proof and artificial social proof. And frankly, their brain doesn't care. It just sees numbers, activity, and presence, and it interprets that as validation. This is why social media platforms are so addictive and so powerful. They've gamified social proof, turning every like, share, comment, and follower into a visible signal of value. And people chase those signals obsessively because the brain craves the safety and validation that social proof provides. This is also why cancel culture is so effective. It weaponizes social proof in reverse, showing that many people reject someone or something, and that mass rejection signals danger, making others afraid to associate with a canceled person or idea, even if they privately disagree with the mob. The fear of being on the wrong side of social proof is so strong that people will abandon their own beliefs, friendships, and principles just to stay aligned with the visible majority. Social proof also plays a massive role in personal identity and self-worth. People don't just want to do what others are doing. They want to be seen doing it, because visibility creates social proof for themselves. This is why people post their achievements, vacations, purchases, and opinions online, not always out of vanity, but because public validation feels like proof that they're living a good, successful, meaningful life. And when that validation doesn't come, when a post gets ignored or criticized, it doesn't just feel disappointing. It feels like social rejection, like proof that they're not good enough, not interesting enough, not worthy of belonging. The absence of social proof can be just as powerful as its presence, and it can make people question their choices, their worth, and their place in the world. The uncomfortable truth is that most of us don't think for ourselves as much as we think we do. We think we're making independent decisions based on personal taste, values, and reasoning, but in reality, we're constantly scanning our environment for social cues and adjusting our behavior to match what we see others doing, thinking, and valuing. This doesn't make us weak or stupid. It makes us human. The key is becoming aware of it, learning to recognize when you're being influenced by social proof, and asking yourself, am I doing this because I genuinely want to, or because I see others doing it? Do I believe this because I've thought it through, or because everyone around me believes it? Am I chasing this goal because it matters to me, or because it's what's supposed to matter? Once you start questioning the invisible pull of social proof, you start reclaiming your autonomy, and you stop letting the crowd make decisions for you. But even then, you'll never be completely free of it, because the need for social validation is wired too deep, and the brain will always, on some level, care about what others think, do, and believe, and that's not entirely a bad thing, as long as you're aware of it and intentional about when you follow the crowd and when you choose to walk your own path. Authority silences independent thinking. There's something deeply unsettling about how easily human beings surrender their own judgment in the presence of authority, and it happens so automatically, so reflexively, that most people don't even realize they've stopped thinking for themselves until it's too late. When someone is seen as an authority, whether it's a doctor, a teacher, a boss, a police officer, a religious leader, a scientist, or even just someone with an impressive title or credential, people stop questioning and start obeying. And this shift happens not because the authority figure has proven themselves right, but simply because they occupy a position that the brain has been trained to respect. Titles, uniforms, credentials, degrees, and symbols of power trigger automatic deference, even when the authority figure is wrong, unethical, incompetent, or acting in their own interests rather than yours. This isn't a flaw in a few weak-minded individuals. It's a universal psychological response that has been demonstrated again and again in some of the most disturbing experiments in social psychology. The most famous of these is the Milgram experiment, where ordinary people were told by a man in a lab coat, a figure of scientific authority, to administer what they believed were painful, potentially lethal electric shocks to another person. The person wasn't really being shocked. It was all staged, but the participants didn't know that. They heard screams, pleas to stop, and eventually silence, and yet the majority of them continued pressing the button. Not because they were sadistic or cruel, but because the authority figure calmly told them to continue, assured them it was necessary, and took responsibility. The presence of authority was enough to override their own moral compass, their empathy, and their common sense. They didn't want to hurt anyone, but they also didn't want to disobey. And in that moment, obedience felt more compelling than morality. This experiment revealed something chilling. Under the right conditions, most people will do things they know are wrong if someone in a position of authority tells them it's okay. And this isn't just about extreme situations. It plays out every single day in ordinary life. When a doctor prescribes medication, most patients don't question it, research it, or ask for alternatives. They just take it, because the doctor is the authority and questioning them feels disrespectful, ignorant, or even dangerous. When a teacher tells a student they're not good at something, the student often internalizes that judgment without questioning whether the teacher might be wrong, biased, or simply having a bad day. When a boss implements a policy that employees know is inefficient or harmful, most stay silent, not because they agree, but because challenging authority feels risky, uncomfortable, and socially inappropriate. Authority doesn't just command obedience. It shuts down critical thinking, and it does this by creating a psychological dynamic where the authority figure is seen as more knowledgeable, more experienced, and more legitimate than you, which makes your own thoughts, doubts, and questions feel insignificant by comparison. The brain essentially outsources judgment to the authority, assuming that if this person has the title, the credentials, or the position, they must know better than you do. And this assumption allows people to stop thinking, stop questioning, and stop taking responsibility for their own choices. This is why authority is such a powerful tool for control, both in benign and malicious contexts. In benign cases, authority structures help society function. We can't all be experts in everything, so we rely on doctors for medical advice, lawyers for legal guidance, and mechanics for car repairs. And most of the time, this works fine. But the problem is that the brain doesn't distinguish between legitimate authority and illegitimate authority, between earned expertise and the mere appearance of expertise. It responds to the symbols, the white coat, the uniform, the title, the confident tone, the official setting. And once those symbols are present, the questioning part of the brain goes quiet. This is why con artists, cult leaders, corrupt officials, and abusive bosses can maintain power for so long. They understand how to present themselves as authority figures. And once people see them that way, they stop questioning, stop resisting, and start complying, even when the authority's actions are clearly harmful. The uniform doesn't have to be real. The credentials don't have to be legitimate. The expertise doesn't have to exist. What matters is whether people perceive authority, because perception is all the brain needs to trigger obedience. This dynamic is especially dangerous because authority figures are human, which means they make mistakes, have biases, act out of self-interest, and sometimes abuse their power. But the people under their influence often don't see or acknowledge these flaws because doing so would require challenging authority. And the brain resists that challenge with surprising force. Admitting that your doctor made a mistake, that your boss is wrong, that your government is lying, or that your spiritual leader is manipulating you feels destabilizing, because these authority figures represent safety, order, and certainty, and questioning them threatens that sense of security. So instead of questioning, people rationalize, make excuses, or simply ignore red flags, because preserving the authority's legitimacy feels more important than confronting uncomfortable truths. This is how systemic abuse continues in institutions. Churches, schools, corporations, governments, hospitals, because people inside those systems see the warning signs but can't bring themselves to challenge the authority structure that's supposed to protect them. The authority silences not just their voices, but their ability to see clearly, and this silence allows harm to continue unchecked. There's also a social cost to questioning authority that reinforces obedience. If you're in a room full of people who are all following orders, nodding along, or comply without question, and you're the only one who speaks up, you're not seen as brave or thoughtful. You're seen as disruptive, difficult, or disrespectful. The group dynamic punishes dissent, and authority figures often know this and use it to their advantage, framing questions as insubordination, challenges as disloyalty, and independent thinking as a threat to collective good. This is why whistleblowers are often ostracized, why students who question teachers are labeled as troublemakers, why employees who push back on bad decisions are sidelined or fired, and why citizens who challenge government narratives are dismissed as conspiracy theorists or radicals. The system protects authority by punishing those who question it, and over time, people learn that it's safer, easier, and more socially acceptable to just go along, even when going along means sacrificing their own judgment, values, and integrity. The scariest part is how this operates even in your own mind. You don't just obey external authority. You internalize it. Once you've been taught to defer to doctors, teachers, bosses, experts, and leaders, that deference becomes a habit, a reflex, and eventually a belief system. You start to think that you're not qualified to have opinions on certain topics, that you don't know enough to question people with more education or experience, that your gut feelings and observations are less valid than official statements or expert opinions. This internalized authority doesn't need anyone to enforce it. You enforce it on yourself, and you do it without even realizing it. You silence your own questions before anyone else has a chance to, and you dismiss your own doubts as ignorance or insecurity, when in reality, those doubts might be the only thing standing between you and a bad decision. The path forward isn't to reject all authority. That would be chaos and frankly impossible. But to develop a healthier, more conscious relationship with it. Authority should be respected when it's earned, questioned when it's unclear, and challenged when it's harmful. But none of that can happen if you're not even aware of how much power authority has over your thinking. The next time you find yourself automatically agreeing with someone because of their title, their credentials, or their position, pause and ask yourself, do I actually agree with this, or am I just deferring to authority? Is this person right because of what they're saying, or because of who they are? Am I thinking for myself, or am I letting someone else think for me? These questions won't always lead you to disagree. Sometimes authority figures are right, and sometimes it makes sense to trust them. But asking the questions keeps your mind active, keeps your judgment intact, and keeps you from becoming the kind of person who follows orders without thinking, who obeys without questioning, and who surrenders their autonomy in exchange for the comfort of being told what to do. The brain loves labels, even false ones. The human brain is a categorizing machine, constantly sorting, labeling, and filing away information about the world and the people in it. And while this ability helps us make sense of complex reality, it also creates one of the most stubborn and damaging patterns in human psychology. The brain loves labels, even false ones, and once a label is attached to a person, the brain filters all future information to confirm that label, making it incredibly difficult to see that person any other way. Once someone is labeled as lazy, smart, dangerous, difficult, unreliable, talented, troubled, or any other descriptor, that label becomes a lens through which every action, word, and behavior is interpreted. And this lens doesn't just shape how others see you, it shapes how you see yourself. This is why stereotypes are so hard to break, why first impressions are so sticky, why reputations can follow people for years or even decades, and why people often live up to the expectations placed on them, not because those expectations were accurate, but because the label became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The process starts innocently enough. Someone does something once. Maybe they're late to a meeting. Maybe they ask a smart question in class. Maybe they lose their temper in a stressful moment. And in that instant, the brain of the person observing them creates a label: unreliable, intelligent, or angry. That label is supposed to be a shortcut, a way to predict future behavior without having to constantly reassess. But the problem is that the brain doesn't treat labels as temporary or conditional. It treats them as identity, as truth, as the essence of who that person is. From that point on, the brain engages in something called confirmation bias, which means it actively looks for evidence that supports the label and ignores, dismisses, or reinterprets evidence that contradicts it. If someone is labeled as lazy, their moment of hard work are seen as anomalies or exceptions. They only worked hard because they had to, or they're just trying to prove something, while their moments of rest or slowness are highlighted and remembered as proof of the label. If someone is labeled as smart, their mistakes are downplayed or excused. Everyone makes mistakes, or they were just overthinking it, while their successes are amplified and attributed to inherent intelligence. The label doesn't describe the person. It rewrites their entire narrative to fit a predetermined story. And once that story is set, it becomes almost impossible to change because the brain resists information that would require it to rebuild its understanding of someone from scratch. This dynamic is especially cruel because the person being labeled often has no control over it and no real way to escape it. A child labeled as a troublemaker in second grade can spend the next 10 years trying to prove they've changed, but teachers, parents, and peers will still see them through that original label, and every small misstep will be magnified, while every improvement will be minimized. A woman labeled as emotional in a corporate setting can present logical, well-researched arguments, but her ideas will be dismissed or attributed to feelings rather than competence, simply because the label has already defined how people interpret her. A man labeled as aggressive or dangerous because of his appearance, his race, or a single outburst will find that people are afraid of him, avoid him, or treat him with suspicion, even when he's calm, kind, and non-threatening, because the label has created a filter that transforms neutral behavior into perceived threat. The label doesn't reflect reality. It creates a version of reality that the brain then seeks to confirm over and over again. What makes this even more insidious is that labels aren't just imposed by others. They're internalized by the person being labeled. And this is where the self-fulfilling prophecy comes into play. When a child is repeatedly told they're not good at math, they start to believe it, and that belief affects their effort, their confidence, and their willingness to try, which leads to poor performance, which reinforces a label, which deepens a belief, and the cycle continues until the label feels like an unchangeable fact about who they are. When a teenager is labeled as a troublemaker, they start to see themselves that way, and if everyone already expects them to misbehave, why bother trying to be good? The label becomes permission to live down to the expectation, because fighting against it feels exhausting, futile, and lonely. When an employee is labeled as not leadership material, they stop putting themselves forward for opportunities, stop speaking up in meetings, and stop developing the skills that would actually make them a leader, not because they lack potential, but because the label has convinced them and everyone around them that they don't have what it takes. The label doesn't just describe, it prescribes, it limits, it shapes identity, and it traps people in a narrow version of themselves that may have never been true in the first place. This is also why stereotypes are so deeply embedded in society and so resistant to change. Stereotypes are just labels applied to entire groups of people based on race, gender, nationality, religion, age, or appearance. And once those labels exist, they function the same way personal labels do. They filter perception, confirm bias, and create self-fulfilling outcomes. If a group is stereotyped as less intelligent, they'll be given fewer educational opportunities, which leads to lower achievement, which is then used as evidence that the stereotype was correct, when in reality, the system created the outcome it claimed to be observing. If a group is stereotyped as dangerous, they'll be treated with suspicion, surveilled more heavily, arrested more frequently, and punished more harshly, which creates statistical patterns that are then pointed to as proof of the danger, when the real cause is the biased treatment that came from the label in the first place. Stereotypes don't describe groups accurately. They create conditions that make the stereotype appear true, and this cycle perpetuates across generations, institutions, and entire cultures, because once a label is socially accepted, It becomes invisible, unquestioned, and self-reinforcing. Breaking free from a label, whether it's personal or social, requires immense effort, awareness, and often the support of people who are willing to see past it. If you've been labeled, you have to consciously fight against internalized belief, challenge the narrative in your own mind, and repeatedly demonstrate through action that the label doesn't define you, even when the world keeps trying to force you back into it. You have to find people who see you without the filter, who judge you based on who you are now rather than who you were in one moment or what someone once said about you. And those people are rare, because most humans are lazy thinkers who prefer the simplicity of a label over the complexity of really knowing someone. And if you're the one doing the labeling, which we all are, whether we admit it or not, you have to train yourself to notice when you've mentally filed someone away under a category and actively resist the urge to let that category define everything you see. You have to practice intellectual humility. Remind yourself that labels are shortcuts, not truth, and be willing to update your perception when someone shows you they're more than the box you put them in. This doesn't mean ignoring patterns or pretending people don't have consistent traits. It means holding those observations lightly, staying open to change, and recognizing that every human being is too complex, too dynamic, and too full of contradictions to ever be fully captured by a single word. The brain loves labels because labels make life easier, faster, and more predictable. But that ease comes at a cost. The cost of really seeing people, the cost of allowing growth and change, and the cost of your own freedom to be more than the labels that have been placed on you. So the next time you hear yourself or someone else use a label, lazy, smart, difficult, talented, weird, normal, whatever it is, pause and ask, is this label true, or is it just a story we're telling? Is this helping me understand this person, or is it preventing me from seeing who they really are? Because once you start questioning labels, you start seeing people, and once you start seeing people, the whole world becomes more human, more nuanced, and infinitely more interesting than any label could ever capture. Fear is the most powerful social control tool. If you want to understand why people do what they do, why they follow rules they don't believe in, why they hide who they really are, and why they make choices that go against their own desires and values, you don't need to look at laws, punishments, or authority. You need to look at fear, because fear is the most powerful social control tool that exists, and it operates silently, invisibly, and relentlessly in almost every aspect of human life. It's not the fear of physical harm that controls most people in modern society. It's the fear of rejection, the fear of judgment, the fear of failure, the fear of being cast out, laughed at, or seen as less than, and these social fears shape behavior far more powerfully than any law, rule, or external consequence ever could. People don't change because they want to. They change because they're afraid of losing status, belonging, love, respect, or the image they've worked so hard to build. And that fear is so deeply wired into the human brain that it can override logic, morality, personal happiness, and even survival instincts in some cases. Fear isn't just an emotion, it's a tool, and it's been used for thousands of years by parents, leaders, institutions, religions, governments, and social groups to keep people in line, obedient, compliant, and predictable. And the reason it works so well is because the fear of social consequences taps into one of the oldest, most primal parts of the brain, the need to belong. For most of human history, being rejected by your tribe, your family, or your community didn't just mean loneliness. It meant death. Without the group, you had no protection, no resources, no chance of survival. So the brain evolved to treat social rejection as an existential threat. And even though the modern world has changed dramatically, the brain hasn't caught up. Today, being rejected won't kill you, but your brain still reacts as if it will, flooding your body with stress hormones, triggering anxiety, and creating a desperate urge to do whatever it takes to get back into the group's good graces. This is why the fear of rejection is so powerful. It's not rational. It's not proportional to the actual danger, but it feels life or death because at one point in our evolutionary history, it was. This fear shows up everywhere, in every layer of society, often disguised as something else. In childhood, fear keeps kids obedient. Not fear of punishment, but fear of disappointing parents. Fear of being embarrassed in front of classmates. Fear of being left out or labeled as weird. A child doesn't follow the rules because they logically understand why the rules matter. They follow because not following means losing approval, safety, or belonging, and that loss feels unbearable. In adolescence, Fear becomes even more intense as social hierarchies solidify, and peer approval becomes more important than almost anything else. Teenagers make dangerous, self-destructive choices not because they don't know better, but because the fear of being excluded, mocked, or seen as uncool outweighs the fear of consequences. They'll skip school, try drugs, engage in risky behavior, or betray their own values just to stay inside the circle, because being outside the circle feels worse than any punishment their parents or school could impose. In adulthood, the fear doesn't go away. It just gets more sophisticated. Adults fear judgment in the workplace, so they stay silent in meetings even when they have good ideas. They don't challenge bad decisions, and they conform to corporate culture even when it conflicts with their ethics, because speaking up could mean being labeled as difficult, losing a promotion, or even losing their job, and the fear of professional failure is tied not just to money but to identity and self-worth. Adults fear judgment in their social lives, so they curate their image carefully, post only the highlights, hide their struggles, and present a version of themselves that fits what they think others expect, because showing vulnerability, admitting failure, or being different feels like inviting rejection. Adults fear judgment in their relationships, so they avoid difficult conversations, suppress their real feelings, and stay in situations that make them unhappy, because the fear of being alone, being seen as unlovable, or losing a relationship entirely feels more terrifying than the pain of staying. Fear doesn't just control individual behavior. It controls entire societies, and this is where it becomes a tool of power. Governments use fear to maintain control, not always through explicit threats, but through the fear of being labeled as unpatriotic, dangerous, or disloyal. When dissent is framed as betrayal, when questioning authority is equated with being a threat to society, people stay silent not because they agree, but because they're afraid of the social and legal consequences of speaking out. Religions use fear to maintain belief and obedience, not just fear of hell or divine punishment, but fear of being cast out of the community, losing family ties, or being seen as immoral or lost. The fear of religious rejection can be so powerful that people suppress doubts, follow rules that don't make sense to them, and even cut off relationships with people they love, because the alternative, losing the identity, community, and sense of purpose that religion provides, feels like losing everything. Corporations use fear to maintain productivity and loyalty, not through overt threats, but through the fear of being replaceable, the fear of falling behind, the fear of not being seen as valuable or hardworking enough. The modern workplace thrives on insecurity, and that insecurity drives people to work longer hours, sacrifice their health and relationships, and stay in toxic environments, because the fear of losing status, income, or relevance is more powerful than the desire for balance or happiness. Social media has weaponized fear in a way that's unprecedented in human history, because it's made judgment public, permanent, and instantaneous. People curate their lives obsessively, not because they're vain, but because they're afraid of being judged for not being successful enough, attractive enough, happy enough, or interesting enough. They avoid posting opinions that might be controversial because they're afraid of backlash, losing followers, or being attacked by strangers. They participate in trends they don't care about and signal values they may not fully hold because of fear of being on the wrong side of public opinion. The fear of being canceled, or the fear of being irrelevant is so overwhelming that authenticity feels like too big a risk. The algorithm rewards fear-driven behavior. Outrage gets engagement, controversy gets clicks, and fear keeps people scrolling, posting, and performing because stopping feels like disappearing, and disappearing feels like social death. The most insidious thing about fear as a control tool is that it doesn't require anyone to actively enforce it. Once fear is internalized, people control themselves. You don't need a boss standing over you to make you work late. You do it yourself because you're afraid of being seen as lazy. You don't need a parent telling you to hide your feelings. You do it yourself because you're afraid of being seen as weak. You don't need a government silencing your voice. You silence yourself because you're afraid of the consequences. Fear becomes self-sustaining, and this is why oppressive systems can function with relatively little direct force. They don't need to constantly threaten people, because people have already learned to threaten themselves, to imagine the worst-case scenario, and to adjust their behavior preemptively to avoid it. And here's the tragedy. Most of the time, the thing people are afraid of isn't even real. The rejection they fear might never happen. The judgment they imagine might be far harsher than anything others would actually think. The failure they're avoiding might not be a failure at all, or it might be a necessary step toward growth. But fear doesn't deal in reality. It deals in possibility, in what could happen, and the brain is wired to overestimate danger and underestimate resilience. So it keeps people small, safe, and stuck, convincing them that staying in line is the only way to survive. The way out of fear-based living isn't to eliminate fear. That's impossible, and maybe not even desirable. But to recognize when fear is making your decisions for you. To ask whether the thing you're afraid of is actually likely, actually important, or actually worth sacrificing your authenticity, freedom, or happiness for. It's to understand that fear is often a signal not of real danger, but of growth, of something that matters, of a boundary you're ready to cross if you can find the courage. It's to build relationships, communities, and environments where vulnerability is safe, where mistakes are allowed, where being different is celebrated rather than punished, because those spaces weaken fear's grip and remind you that rejection isn't death, judgment isn't truth, and failure isn't final. Fear will always be part of the human experience. But it doesn't have to be the thing that runs your life, shapes your choices, or keeps you from becoming the person you actually want to be. And the moment you start making decisions based on what you want rather than what you're afraid of, you take back control, not just from external forces that use fear to manipulate you, but from the internal voice that's been using it to keep you small. Silence is also communication. In a world obsessed with words, with speeches, texts, and endless conversations, we've forgotten one of the most powerful truths about human communication. Silence is also communication, and sometimes it speaks louder, clearer, and more honestly than anything that could be said out loud. What people don't say often reveals far more than the words they do say, because silence carries meaning, intention, and emotion in ways that language sometimes can't or won't. Avoidance, hesitation, pauses, the lack of response, the sudden change of subject, the things that are carefully left unspoken, all of these are forms of communication, and they signal discomfort, disagreement, fear, resentment, love, respect, or 1,000 other feelings that the person either can't articulate or has chosen not to. Social psychology teaches us to read the gaps, not just the speech, because the gaps are where the truth often hides, where the unfiltered reaction lives before it gets shaped into acceptable words. And if you learn to pay attention to what's missing, to what's avoided, to what's met with silence instead of sound, you'll understand people on a level that most never reach. Silence isn't empty. It's full, dense with information, and the meaning it carries depends entirely on context, relationship, and timing. When you ask someone a question and they hesitate before answering, that hesitation is communication. It tells you they're uncertain, conflicted, or carefully choosing their words because the truth might be uncomfortable. When you share good news and someone responds with a long pause before offering congratulations, that pause speaks volumes. It might reveal jealousy, surprise, doubt, or the efforts taken to seem happy for you when they're not. When you say something vulnerable or emotional and you're met with silence, that silence could mean they're processing, they're uncomfortable, they don't know how to respond, or they simply don't care enough to engage, and each of those possibilities tells you something important about the relationship and the person you're dealing with. Silence after conflict is one of the most loaded forms of communication. It can be a withdrawal, a punishment, a way of asserting control, or a need for space to cool down and think. And without understanding which kind of silence it is, you can misread the entire situation. The silent treatment, for example, is a weapon, a form of emotional manipulation where one person withholds communication to create anxiety, guilt, or submission in the other. And it's effective precisely because silence in a relationship feels like absence, like a door being closed, and the person on the receiving end will often do anything to break that silence, to get back into connection, even if it means apologizing for things they didn't do or accepting blame they don't deserve. But not all silence is hostile. Sometimes it's protective, a way of avoiding conflict, protecting feelings, or refusing to engage in an argument that won't lead anywhere productive. Some people go silent because they don't trust themselves to speak without saying something they'll regret. And in those moments, silence is self-control, not coldness. The challenge is that silence is ambiguous. And because it doesn't come with an explanation, the person experiencing it has to interpret it. And interpretation is where misunderstanding happens, because people tend to fill silence with their own fears, insecurities, and assumptions rather than asking what it actually means. When someone does respond to your message, your mind might immediately jump to rejection. They're ignoring you. They don't care, they're angry, but the reality could be completely different. They might be busy, overwhelmed, unsure how to respond, Or they might have read it and genuinely forgotten to reply. And none of those things have anything to do with how they feel about you. But silence leaves room for your mind to create a story, and that story is almost always worse than the truth. This is why silence can be so painful in relationships. It's not just the absence of words, it's the presence of uncertainty, and uncertainty triggers the brain's threat response because the brain hates not knowing. It needs closure, clarity, resolution. And when it doesn't get that, it fills the void with worst-case scenarios. Silence also functions as a form of consent or complicity in group settings, and this is where it becomes socially and morally significant. When something wrong is happening, a racist comment, an unethical decision, a harmful policy, an abusive behavior, and people stay silent, that silence is not neutral. It's a form of agreement, or at least a form of permission. Because silence doesn't challenge the status quo, it allows it to continue unchallenged. This is why oppressive systems rely on silence. They don't need everyone to actively support them. They just need enough people to stay quiet, and silence does the work of agreement without requiring anyone to take a public stance. This is why speaking up is so hard and so important. Because breaking the silence disrupts the illusion of consensus, and even one voice can shift the entire dynamic of a room, a meeting, a community, or a culture. But people stay silent in these moments not because they agree, but because they're afraid of being judged, attacked, isolated, or labeled as difficult. And so they calculate that their silence is safer than their voice, even when their silence allows harm to continue. The absence of a response is also communication in modern digital life, where we're constantly connected and constantly expected to respond. And the decision not to respond has become its own language. Leaving someone on read, not liking a post, not commenting when you used to, unfollowing without explanation, all of these are silent messages, and are often more cutting than words because they signal a withdrawal of attention, validation, or care. And in a world where those things have become currency, their absence is felt sharply. People will obsess over why someone didn't respond, why someone didn't engage, why someone pulled back. And that obsession is proof of how much weight silence carries in the absence of clarity. Silence in conversations also creates space, and this is one of its most underrated powers. When someone shares something heavy, something painful, something vulnerable, the instinct is often to fill the space with words, to offer advice, reassurance, solutions, or even just to say something so the silence doesn't feel awkward. But sometimes silence is the most respectful, most compassionate response, because it gives a person room to sit with what they just said, to not have their experience immediately redirected or minimized. Sitting in silence with someone, especially in moments of grief, fear, or confusion, is a form of presence, and presence is often more valuable than any words you could offer. It says, I'm here. I'm not running away from this discomfort. I'm not trying to fix you. I'm just with you, and that kind of silence is connection, not distance. But you have to be comfortable with silence to offer it, and most people aren't. They're so uncomfortable with quiet, with empty space, with not knowing what to say, that they rush to fill it, often making things worse in the process. Learning to be comfortable with silence, to not panic when a conversation pauses, to not feel responsible for filling every gap, is a skill, and it's one that makes you a better listener, a better friend, and a better reader people, because you're not so busy talking or planning your next words that you miss what's happening in the silence. Silence can also be defiance, a refusal to participate, to explain yourself, to justify your choices to people who don't deserve an explanation. When someone demands an answer and you stay silent, you're asserting a boundary. You're saying that you don't owe them your words, your justifications, or your energy, and that silence can be empowering, especially in relationships or situations where speaking has been used to manipulate, trap, or exhaust you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply not engage, not defend, not explain, and let your silence be the answer. It's a reclaiming of control, a refusal to play a game you can't win, and it's a reminder that you don't have to participate in every conversation, every conflict, or every demand placed on you. The key to understanding silence is to stop treating it as the absence of communication and start treating it as a different form of it, one that requires attention, context, and curiosity. Instead of assuming you know what someone's silence means, ask, I noticed you went quiet, what's going on? Or, you didn't respond, and I'm wondering how you're feeling about this. Instead of filling silence with your own anxieties, sit with it, observe it, and see what it's actually communicating. And instead of using silence as a weapon or a hiding place, be intentional about it. If you need space, say so. If you're uncomfortable, acknowledge it. If you're choosing not to respond, own that choice rather than leaving people in a fog of uncertainty. Silence will always be part of human interaction, and it will always carry meaning. But whether that meaning is destructive or constructive, manipulative or respectful, fearful or confident, depends on how it's used and how it's interpreted. And the more skilled you become at reading silence, the more you'll see what people are really saying even when their mouths are closed. Repetition creates belief. There's a strange and unsettling quirk in how the human brain processes information, and once you understand it, you'll start seeing it everywhere, manipulating elections, selling products, shaping culture, and even controlling what you believe about yourself. And that quirk is this: repetition creates belief. The brain doesn't carefully evaluate every piece of information it receives and decide whether it's true based on evidence, logic, or credibility. Instead, it uses a shortcut, and that shortcut is familiarity. When people hear something often enough, see it repeated across multiple sources, or encounter the same idea again and again, the brain starts to treat that repetition as a signal of truth, even when there's no evidence to support it, even when the claim is demonstrably false, and even when the person consciously knows better. The brain equates familiarity with truth because, in evolutionary terms, this shortcut usually worked. If you heard the same warning about a dangerous animal from multiple people in your tribe, it was probably true, and acting on that information kept you alive. But in the modern world, where information can be deliberately repeated, amplified, and spread at scale, this mental shortcut has become a vulnerability. And it's being exploited constantly by advertisers, propagandists, politicians, influencers, and anyone who understands that if you say something enough times, people will start to believe it, not because you've proven it, but simply because they've heard it before. This is why propaganda works, why advertising is effective, why social media narratives gain momentum even when they're based on misinformation, and why lies, if repeated often enough, can become accepted as fact by millions of people who never bother to verify them because the repetition itself felt like verification. Psychologists call this the illusory truth effect, and it's been proven in study after study. When people are exposed to the same statement multiple times, they rate it as more true than statements they've only heard once, regardless of whether the statement is actually accurate. It doesn't matter if the statement is absurd, unfamiliar, or contradicts what they already know. Repetition increases perceived truthfulness, and this effect happens even when people are explicitly told that the repeated information might be false. The brain isn't weighing evidence. It's recognizing a pattern, and patterns feel safe, reliable, and true, even when they're not. This is why advertising doesn't try to convince you with facts and logic. It tries to embed a message in your brain through sheer repetition. You see the same brand, the same slogan, the same jingle, the same imagery over and over again across TV, social media, billboards, and podcasts. And even if you consciously dismiss it as manipulation, even if you think you're immune to advertising, the repetition is working beneath your awareness. The next time you're in a store and you reach for a familiar brand over an unfamiliar one, it's not because you research which product is better. It's because familiarity feels like trust, and repetition created that familiarity. Companies spend billions of dollars not to give you new information, but to make sure their name, their logo, their message is repeated so often that it becomes part of the mental landscape. And once it's there, it influences your choices without you even realizing it. Propaganda uses the same mechanism, but with far more dangerous consequences. When a political leader repeats the same phrase, the same accusation, the same narrative over and over, the media is the enemy. The election was stolen. They are coming for your freedom. It doesn't matter if these statements are true. It doesn't matter if they're debunked by evidence, because the repetition itself is doing the work. People hear it at rallies, on television, in social media posts, from friends and family who've also absorbed the message, and slowly, incrementally, the repeated claim starts to feel true, not because it was proven, but because it became familiar, and familiarity bypasses critical thinking. This is why authoritarian regimes invest so heavily in controlling the narrative and flooding the information space with their version of reality. They don't need to convince everyone through argument. They just need to repeat their message loudly, consistently, and everywhere until it becomes a dominant story. And once a story is repeated enough, it becomes reality for those who hear it, even if it's built on lies. Social media has turbocharged this effect because it's designed to amplify repetition. When a claim, a rumor, a conspiracy theory, or even just a catchy phrase starts circulating, the algorithm rewards it with visibility. And suddenly millions of people are seeing the same idea repeated from dozens of different accounts. And each repetition reinforces the illusion of truth. It doesn't matter if the original source is credible. What matters is that the message is everywhere, and the brain interprets that ubiquity as validation. This is why misinformation spreads so quickly and why it's so hard to correct. By the time fact-checkers debunk a false claim, it's already been repeated thousands of times, and those repetitions have created a belief that feels true. And once something feels true, people resist information that contradicts it because changing your mind requires effort, discomfort, and admitting you were wrong, and the brain avoids all of those things. So even when people are shown evidence that a repeated claim is false, many will dismiss the evidence, rationalize why it doesn't apply, or simply ignore it, because the repetition has done its job. It's created a belief that's now part of their identity, their worldview, and their sense of reality. Repetition doesn't just shape beliefs about external facts, it shapes beliefs about yourself. And this is where it becomes deeply personal. If you were told repeatedly as a child that you're not good enough, not smart enough, not talented enough, or not worthy of love, those statements didn't need to be true to affect you. They just needed to be repeated. And the repetition turned them into beliefs that you carried into adulthood, beliefs that influence your choices, your relationships, and your sense of self-worth. This is why negative self-talk is so damaging. When you repeat the same critical, harsh, limiting thoughts to yourself day after day, your brain starts to accept them as truth, not because they're accurate, but because they're familiar, and familiarity creates conviction. And this works in reverse too. If you repeatedly tell yourself that you're capable, that you're worthy, that you can handle challenges, those repeated affirmations don't have to feel true at first, but over time, the repetition will start to shift your belief, because the brain is wired to accept what it hears often, even from itself. This is the principle behind affirmations, mantras, and positive psychology. It's not magic. It's just leveraging the brain's tendency to equate repetition with reality. The same effect shows up in relationships, where repeated phrases, whether positive or negative, shape how people see each other. If someone repeatedly tells you that you're difficult, dramatic, or unreliable, you might start to believe it and even behave in ways that confirm it. Not because it was ever true, but because the repetition created a story that became a self-fulfilling prophecy. And if someone repeatedly tells you that you're valued, loved, and appreciated, those repeated affirmations build trust, security, and connection, because the brain internalizes them as truth, as evidence of how the relationship works. Words repeated over time become the foundation of identity and reality within a relationship. And this is why what you say to the people you love and what you allow them to say to you matters so much. Because repetition doesn't just influence belief in the moment, it builds the structure of how people see themselves and each other over the long term. Repetition also explains why cultural norms, stereotypes, and societal beliefs persist even when they're harmful or illogical. If society repeatedly tells girls that they're not good at math, that message is repeated by parents, teachers, media, and peers, and it becomes a belief that affects confidence, effort, and outcomes, which then reinforces the original message, creating a cycle that persists across generations. If a culture repeatedly frames certain groups as dangerous, lazy, or inferior, those repeated messages become ingrained assumptions, and people start to see those groups through that lens, interpreting neutral behavior as confirming the stereotype, because the repetition has created a filter that distorts perception. Breaking these cycles requires not just counting the message once, but repeating a different message just as consistently, just as loudly, and over just as long a period, because undoing the effect of repetition requires repetition in the opposite direction. And that's hard, exhausting work that most people and institutions aren't willing to commit to. The uncomfortable truth is that repetition works regardless of truth, and this means that whoever controls the repetition controls belief, controls perception, and in many ways, controls reality itself. This is why media literacy, critical thinking, and skepticism are so important. Not because you should distrust everything, but because you need to be aware that your sense of what's true is being shaped not just by evidence, but by how often you've encountered an idea. And frequency is not the same as accuracy. The next time you find yourself believing something strongly, ask yourself, do I believe this because I've seen the evidence, or do I believe it because I've heard it repeated so many times that it feels true? Have I actually verified this, or have I just absorbed it through repetition? And if you want to change a belief, your own or someone else's, understand that a single conversation, a single fact, a single piece of evidence is rarely enough. Because a belief you're challenging has probably been built through repetition over time, and dismantling will require patience, consistency, and the willingness to repeat a new message over and over until the brain finally starts to accept it, not because you've proven it beyond all doubt, but because repetition is a language. The brain understands best, for better or for worse. People protect their identity, not the truth. One of the most frustrating and illuminating truths about human nature is that people don't protect the truth. They protect their identity, and once a belief, a value, or an idea becomes woven into someone's sense of self, logic stops working, evidence stops matching, and reason becomes irrelevant, because challenging that belief no longer feels like an intellectual disagreement. It feels like a personal attack, a threat to who they are, and the brain will fight to defend identity far more fiercely than it will ever fight to defend truth. This is why debates rarely change minds, why presenting someone with facts often makes them dig in deeper, and why people can look at the same evidence and come to completely opposite conclusions. They're not actually evaluating the evidence objectively. They're filtering it through the lens of identity, asking not, is this true, but does this threaten who I am, what I believe about myself, and the group I belong to? And if the answer is yes, the evidence will be rejected, dismissed, or reinterpreted, no matter how strong it is. Identity is the most protected territory in the human psyche, and anything that crosses into that territory is met with immediate, often irrational resistance, because the brain treats threats to identity the same way it treats threats to survival, with alarm, defensiveness, and an overwhelming need to preserve what feels essential to existence. When someone defines themselves by a political party, challenging their political beliefs doesn't feel like a conversation. It feels like you're saying they're wrong about who they are, that they've been foolish, that they don't belong where they thought they did. And that kind of existential discomfort is so unbearable that the mind will do anything to avoid it, including rejecting reality itself. When someone's identity is tied to their religion, questioning their faith isn't just about theology. It's about family, community, meaning, purpose, and the entire framework through which they understand the world. And asking them to reconsider that framework feels like asking them to tear down their entire life and start over, which is terrifying, destabilizing, and deeply threatening. When someone's identity is built around being smart, successful, or right, admitting they were wrong about something significant doesn't just feel like a mistake. It feels like a collapse of self-worth, a validation of every insecurity they've ever had. And the ego will fight tooth and nail to avoid that feeling, even if it means clinging to a belief that no longer makes sense. Identity-based thinking shows up everywhere, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. When someone says, I'm a liberal or I'm a conservative, they're not just describing their political views. They're telling you who they are, and from that point on, their brain will automatically align with whatever positions, narratives, and tribes are associated with that identity, often without even evaluating those positions individually. If their side supports a policy, they'll find reasons to support too, and if the other side supports something, they'll find reasons to oppose it, not because they've carefully analyzed the issue, but because their identity demands consistency, loyalty, and alignment with the group. This is why people can hold contradictory beliefs without discomfort. As long as those beliefs are wrapped in the same identity label, the brain doesn't see them as contradictions. It sees them as loyalty. When someone's identity is tied to their career, I'm a doctor, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a teacher, their entire sense of value, competence, and purpose becomes dependent on that role, and anything that threatens it, whether it's criticism, failure, or change, feels like it's threatening their entire existence. This is why people stay in careers that make them miserable, why they resist feedback even when it's constructive, and why career setbacks can lead to full-blown identity crises. Because they fuse what they do with who they are, and losing one feels like losing both. When someone's identity is tied to being a good person, being moral, or being on the right side of history, they become unable to acknowledge their own mistakes, biases, or harmful behaviors, because doing so would contradict the identity they built, and the brain will protect that identity even at the cost of truth, growth, or accountability. This is why people who see themselves as non-racist can engage in racist behavior and not see it. Why people who see themselves as kind can be cruel and rationalize it, and why people who see themselves as logical can be completely irrational without recognizing the contradiction. The identity is a shield, and the shield is so strong that it distorts perception to protect itself. The problem with identity-based thinking is that it makes growth almost impossible, because growth requires admitting you were wrong, updating your beliefs, and sometimes even changing who you are, and all those things feel like losses, like betrayals of the self, rather than what they actually are, signs of learning, maturity, and courage. When someone has spent years, sometimes decades, building an identity around a set of beliefs, relationships, or roles, asking them to change is asking them to grieve the person they thought they were, to let go of the community that validated them, and to step into uncertainty without knowing who they'll be on the other side. And most people aren't willing to do that, especially not in the middle of a debate or conversation where they feel attacked, judged, or cornered. This is why debates almost never change minds. They activate defensiveness. They trigger the brain's threat response, and they push people further into their existing identity rather than opening them up to new possibilities. When you argue with someone, you're not having a calm exchange of ideas. You're threatening their sense of self, and the harder you push, the harder they'll resist, not because they're stupid or stubborn, but because you've unknowingly activated the most powerful protective mechanism in the human mind. This is also why people change their minds slowly, quietly, and usually in private, not in the heat of an argument, but in moments of reflection, solitude, or when they encounter information in a non-threatening way that allows them to consider without their identity being on the line. People change when they feel safe enough to let go of an old identity and construct a new one. And that process takes time, space, and often support of people who don't make them feel stupid or weak for having believed something different in the past. Shaming someone, mocking them, or aggressively fact-checking them in public might feel satisfying, but almost never works, because it only reinforces their need to protect their identity. And when identity is under attack, logic becomes irrelevant and evidence becomes the enemy. Identity protection also explains why people stay in toxic relationships, abusive groups, or harmful belief systems long after the damage is obvious. Leaving will require admitting that they were wrong, that they wasted time, that they were deceived or hurt, and that admission feels like a loss of dignity, intelligence, and control. So instead, they double down, rationalize, and convince themselves that things aren't as bad as they seem, because protecting the identity of someone who made the right choice feels more important than protecting their actual well-being. This is why cult members don't just walk away when presented with evidence that their leader is a fraud. They've invested their entire identity in the group. And leaving means losing not just a group, but their sense of purpose, community, and meaning, which feels like death. This is why people stay loyal to companies that exploit them, political leaders who betray them, and ideologies that harm them, because their identity has become so intertwined with that loyalty that separating from it feels like self-destruction. The path forward isn't to attack people's identities or try to forcefully change them. That never works and usually backfires. But to understand that identity is sacred territory, and if you want someone to consider a different perspective, you have to make it safe for them to do so without losing their sense of self. This means approaching conversations with curiosity rather than judgment, asking questions instead of making accusations, and creating space for someone to explore doubt, uncertainty, or alternative views without feeling like they're betraying who they are or the people they care about. It means acknowledging that change in your mind is a sign of strength, not weakness, and that holding on to a belief just because you've always held it is actually more limiting than letting it go when it no longer serves you. And it means recognizing that your own beliefs are also tied to your identity, and you're just as vulnerable to this dynamic as anyone else. There are ideas you cling to not because they're true, but because letting them go would force you to rethink who you are, and that's uncomfortable, so you avoid it, justify it, and defend it without realizing that you're protecting identity, not truth. The most intellectually honest thing you can do is regularly ask yourself, what do I believe because it's true, and what do I believe because it's part of my identity? What would I have to give up socially or emotionally if I change my mind about this? And am I willing to update my beliefs if the evidence no longer supports them, even if it means disappointing people I respect, leaving communities I belong to, or admitting I was wrong? These questions are hard. They're destabilizing, and they require a level of self-awareness and humility that most people avoid. But they're also the only way to break free from identity-based thinking and move towards something closer to truth. People protect their identity because identity gives them a place in the world, a sense of who they are, and a feeling of safety in a chaotic, uncertain reality. And that protection is understandable, even necessary in some contexts. But when identity becomes so rigid, so defended, So fused with belief that it prevents growth, connection, and truth, it stops being protective and starts being a prison. And the only way out is to recognize that you are not your beliefs, you're not your mistakes, you are not your past. And changing your mind doesn't erase who you've been. It just means you're becoming someone new, someone more aligned with reality. And that's not a loss, it's an evolution. Power changes empathy. There's a dark and unsettling transformation that happens when people gain power, status, or influence, and it's so subtle, so gradual, that most don't even notice it happening to them. Power changes empathy, and not in a good way. As people climb hierarchies, accumulate wealth, gain authority, or simply move into positions where they control over others, their ability to feel, understand, and respond to other people's emotions often decreases, sometimes dramatically. Power shifts focus inward, turning attention away from the needs, feelings, and perspectives of others and redirecting it toward the self, toward personal goals, desires, and priorities. And this shift reduces sensitivity to social cues, emotional feedback, and the subtle signals that communicate how others are really feeling. The person who was once thoughtful, considerate, and attuned to those around them can become dismissive, self-absorbed, and blind to the struggles of people they now have power over. And this isn't just a personality flaw or moral failing. It's a documented psychological phenomenon that's been studied extensively. It reveals something uncomfortable about human nature. Power corrupts, not always in obvious, villainous ways, but in quiet, insidious ways that erode compassion, connection, and the ability to see others as fully human. When you have little power, when you're low in a hierarchy or depend on others for resources, approval, or safety, you have to be empathetic. You have to read the room, anticipate the needs and moods of people above you, adjust your behavior to avoid conflict, and stay attuned to social dynamics because your survival, your success, and your well-being depend on understanding and navigating the emotions of others. Empathy in this context isn't just a virtue, it's a survival skill, and people without power develop it out of necessity. But when you gain power, that necessity disappears. You no longer have to worry as much about how others feel, because you're no longer dependent on their approval, their cooperation, or their goodwill in the same way. Your focus shifts from managing relationships to achieving goals, from reading others to asserting your will, and slowly, incrementally, the mental muscle of empathy atrophies because it's no longer being used, no longer needed, and the brain, always looking for efficiency, stops investing energy in something that no longer serves an immediate purpose. Studies have shown that people in positions of power are less likely to take another person's perspective, less accurate at reading facial expressions and emotions, less responsive to others' suffering, and more likely to interrupt, talk over, or ignore people with less power. They're also more likely to engage in risky, impulsive, or unethical behavior because the feedback mechanisms that would normally regulate their actions, social disapproval, consequences, the discomfort of seeing others hurt, are weakened or absent. When you're powerful, people don't always tell you when you've crossed a line, not because the line wasn't crossed, but because they're afraid of the consequences of speaking up. So you stop receiving the honest, critical feedback that would help you course correct. And without that feedback, you lose the ability to accurately assess your own behavior and its impact on others. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. Power reduces empathy. Reduced empathy leads to behavior that hurts or ignores others. That behavior goes unchallenged because people are afraid or unable to push back, and a lack of pushback reinforces a belief that the behavior is acceptable, which further reduces empathy. And the cycle continues until the person with power becomes almost completely disconnected from the reality of those beneath them. This is why leaders, CEOs, politicians, celebrities, and anyone with significant power can seem so out of touch, so tone-deaf, so unable to understand why their decisions or words are harmful. They're not pretending. They genuinely don't see it, because their position has insulated them from the emotional and social feedback that would make the harm visible. You see this everywhere. Bosses who don't understand why their employees are stressed, burned out, or leaving because they're focused on metrics, targets, and performance, and they've lost the ability to see the human cost of their demands. Politicians who make policies that devastate communities without feeling or even acknowledging the suffering because they're surrounded by advisors, wealth, and privilege that shield them from the consequences of their decisions. Celebrities who say or do offensive things and seem genuinely confused by the backlash because their status has created a bubble where everyone agrees with them, laughs at their jokes, and tolerates behavior that would be unacceptable from anyone else. Wealthy people who can't understand why others struggle financially because their own experience of abundance has made them blind to the reality of scarcity, and they assume that if they succeeded, anyone could, ignoring the structural advantages, luck, and privilege that contributed to their success. Power doesn't just change how people see others. It changes how they see themselves, inflating their sense of competence, intelligence, and deservingness while diminishing their awareness of flaws, mistakes, and the role of external factors in their success. Psychologists call this the power paradox. The qualities that help people gain power, like empathy, collaboration, generosity, and social intelligence, are often the very qualities that erode once they have power, and this creates a situation where the people most in need of empathy, those with the most influence, the most control, the most ability to impact others, are the least capable of it. This is inevitable. Some people gain power and manage to retain their empathy, their humility, and their connection to others, but it requires conscious, deliberate effort, constant self-reflection, and structures that hold powerful people accountable and force them to stay connected to the experiences of those they have power over. Without that effort, the default trajectory is toward attachment, self-focus, and a slow but steady loss of the ability to truly care about others in a meaningful, visceral way. Power also changes empathy by changing who you spend time with and whose emotions you're exposed to. When you gain status, you tend to surround yourself with people of similar or higher status, and you spend less time with people who are struggling, marginalized, or less powerful, and this shift in social circles narrows your emotional world. You stop hearing the stories, seeing the struggles, and feeling the pain of people outside your bubble, and without that exposure, empathy fades not because you become a bad person, but because empathy requires contact, connection, and the visceral experience of witnessing someone else's reality. And when you're insulated from that reality by wealth, status, or position, empathy becomes abstract, theoretical, and ultimately insufficient. This is why diversity in leadership matters, why proximity to suffering matters, why listening to people with less power matters, not just as a moral principle, but as a practical necessity for maintaining the kind of empathy that leads to ethical, human-centered decision-making. The loss of empathy that comes with power doesn't just harm others. It harms a powerful person too, because it isolates them, makes their relationships more transactional and less genuine, and robs them of the deep, meaningful connections that make life satisfying. People with power often report feeling lonely, mistrustful, and unsure of who really cares about them versus who just wants something from them. And that's not paranoia. It's a legitimate consequence of dynamic where power creates distance, where people are afraid to be honest, where relationships become performances, and where the powerful person has lost the empathy needed to truly connect with others beyond surface-level interactions. The person at the top might have wealth, influence, and control, but they often lack the very thing that makes life feel rich and worthwhile: authentic, empathetic, reciprocal human connection. So what do you do with this knowledge? If you're someone who has or is gaining power, you have to actively fight against a natural pull towards self-focus and empathy erosion. You have to intentionally seek out feedback, create spaces where people can be honest with you without fear, expose yourself to the experiences and struggles of people with less power, and regularly check in with yourself to ask, am I listening? Am I considering how my actions affect others? Am I staying connected to the human impact of my decisions? Or am I just focused on outcomes efficiency? You have to treat empathy like a skill that needs practice, not a trait you either have or don't, and you have to recognize that your position makes it harder, not easier, to maintain that skill. So you have to work harder at it. And if you're someone without power, dealing with people who have it, understanding this dynamic can help you navigate those relationships more effectively. You'll stop expecting empathy from people whose position has likely diminished it. You'll stop taking their lack of awareness personally. And you'll find ways to communicate that make your needs, concerns, and humanity visible even to people who stop naturally seeing it. You'll also be more vigilant about your own empathy if and when you gain power, because you'll know that the transformation isn't something that happens to bad people. It's something that happens to almost everyone unless they consciously resist it. Power changes empathy, but it doesn't have to destroy it. And the people who manage to hold on to their humanity while holding power are the ones who understand that empathy isn't automatic. It's not passive, and it's not something you can take for granted. It's something you have to choose, protect, and practice every single day, especially when you no longer have to. People remember how you made them feel, not what you said. There's a truth about human memory that changes everything about how you interact with people, how you build relationships, and how you leave a lasting impact. And that truth is this: people remember how you made them feel, not what you said. You can have the most eloquent conversation, deliver the most logical argument, share the most valuable advice, or say all the right words, but if the emotional tone of that interaction is cold, dismissive, condescending, or uncomfortable, that's what will be remembered. And if the emotional tone is warm, validating, uplifting, or safe, that feeling will stay long after the words fade. Emotions anchor memories in a way that facts and language never can. Because the brain processes emotional experiences differently than it processes information, emotional memories are vivid, visceral, and deeply encoded, while factual memories are fragile, easily distorted, and often forgotten entirely. A conversation may be forgotten. The exact words you said may disappear from someone's conscious mind within hours or days, but the feeling it created stays, sometimes for years, sometimes for a lifetime, and that feeling shapes how that person sees you, how they talk about you, and whether they want to be around you again. Influence comes less from words and more from emotional experience. And once you understand this, you stop obsessing over saying the perfect thing and start focusing on creating the right feeling. Because the feeling is what lasts, the feeling is what builds trust, connection, loyalty, and love, and the feeling is what people carry with them long after you're gone. This is why you can't remember most of the things your parents, teachers, or friends said to you growing up, but you can remember exactly how they made you feel, whether you felt seen, valued, and safe, or whether you felt judged, ignored, or small. Those emotional imprints don't fade the way words do. They become part of your internal landscape, shaping your self-concept, your relationships, and even your life choices in ways you might not fully understand. A teacher who believed in you might have said things you've forgotten, but the feeling of being believed in stays, and becomes a voice in your head that says you can do hard things. A parent who was critical might have meant well and given reasonable advice, but the delivery made you feel inadequate. That feeling becomes a lens through which you see yourself, and it lingers even when the specific criticisms are long forgotten. A friend who was there for you in a moment of pain might not remember what they said, and you might not either, but the feeling of not being alone, of being held in your hurt, becomes a memory your body keeps, and it makes that friendship precious in a way that transcends words. This is why apologies that are technically correct but emotionally flat don't work. They might check all the logical boxes, acknowledge the mistake, and offer amends, but if they don't create the feeling of genuine remorse, understanding, and care, the person receiving the apology won't feel it, won't accept it deeply, and won't let repair the relationship, because what they needed wasn't just an admission of fault. They needed to feel that you understood the pain you caused and that you truly cared about making it right. It's also why compliments that are awkward, overly formal, or delivered without warmth don't land the way sincere, heartfelt praise does. The words might be nice, but the feeling is off, and the brain picks up on that dissonance and dismisses a compliment as insincere or obligatory. People are emotional creatures first and logical creatures second, and even though we like to think we're rational, most of our decisions, preferences, and memories are driven by how things made us feel, not by the objective content of what was said or done. This is also why some people can say the harshest truths and you'll still love them, while others can say kind things and you'll still distrust them. It's not about the words, it's about the emotional undercurrent, the authenticity, the respect, and the care that either is or isn't present beneath the surface. When someone criticizes you, but you can feel that it's coming from a place of genuine concern, investment, and belief in your potential, it might sting, but it doesn't damage the relationship. In fact, it often strengthens it, because the feeling is one of being seen, cared for, and challenged to grow. But when someone praises you and you can feel that it's manipulative, shallow, or self-serving, it creates distance and mistrust, because the feeling is one of being used, not valued. The words don't matter as much as the emotional truth behind them, and people are far better at detecting that emotional truth than they are at analyzing the logical structure of what's being said. This principle is at the core of effective leadership, teaching, parenting, and friendship. The leaders people remember and follow aren't necessarily the ones with the best strategies or the most impressive credentials. They're the ones who made people feel inspired, valued, capable, and safe. The teachers who change lives aren't the ones with the most knowledge. They're the ones who made students feel seen, believed in, and excited to learn. The parents who raised confident, resilient children aren't the ones who had all the answers or never made mistakes. They're the ones who made their kids feel loved, supported, and secure even in the midst of discipline, failure, or conflict. The friends who matter aren't the ones who always know what to say. They're the ones who make you feel accepted, understood, and less alone in the world. These emotional experiences don't require perfect words, perfect timing, or perfect execution. They require presence, sincerity, and a willingness to connect on a human level rather than just an intellectual one. This is also why toxic people can do so much damage even when they're not overtly abusive. They create feelings of anxiety, inadequacy, confusion, and exhaustion, and those feelings accumulate over time until being around that person feels draining, unsafe, or painful. Even if you can't always point to specific terrible things they've said or done, the harm isn't always in the words. It's an emotional atmosphere they create, the way they make you feel small, wrong, or constantly on edge. And that feeling is what you remember, what you carry, and what eventually drives you to distance yourself or leave entirely. On the flip side, there are people who might not be the most articulate, the most interesting, or the most successful, but being around them feels good. They make you feel lighter, calmer, more yourself. And those are the people you want to spend time with, the people you trust, the people you remember fondly even if you can't recall a single specific conversation you've had. The emotional residue of interactions is more powerful than the content, and most people don't realize this. So they focus on saying the right things, impressing others with their knowledge, or winning arguments, when what actually matters is whether the other person walks away feeling respected, valued, heard, or uplifted. If you want to be influential, persuasive, or memorable, you can't just focus on your words. You have to think about the emotional experience you're creating. Are you making people feel judged or accepted, dismissed or heard, small or empowered, anxious or safe, bored or engaged? The answers to these questions will determine whether people want to be around you, whether they trust you, and whether they remember you as someone who added something meaningful to their life or someone who just took up space. This doesn't mean you have to be fake, performatively positive, or emotionally manipulative. Authentic emotional connection is different from manufactured charm, and people can feel the difference. It means being intentional about how you show up, being aware of the impact your tone, body language, attention, and energy have on others, and caring enough to adjust when you notice that you're creating a feeling you don't intend. It means listening not just to respond, but to understand, not just to fix, but to validate, not just to be right, but to connect. It means recognizing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not say anything profound at all, but just be present, be kind, be patient, and let the other person feel that they matter to you. Those moments create the kind of memories that last, the kind that shape how people see themselves in the world, and the kind that make you someone people think of with warmth, gratitude, and respect long after the details of your interactions have faded. This is also why ending relationships, jobs, or phases of life with care and respect matters so much. People might forget the good times, they might forget the accomplishments or the everyday moments, but they will never forget how you made them feel in the end. If you left them feeling discarded, betrayed, or invisible, that's the memory that will define the entire relationship, no matter how good it was before. If you left them feeling respected, appreciated, and cared for even in the ending, that's what they'll carry, and that's what allows a relationship to be remembered with fondness rather than bitterness. The emotional punctuation at the end of an experience is disproportionately powerful in shaping the overall memory. And this is true for everything from romantic relationships to work environments to casual friendships. How it ends often determines how it's remembered, and how it's remembered determines the story people tell themselves and others about who you are. So if you want to leave a legacy, if you want to be someone who matters in the lives of the people you encounter, stop worrying so much about being impressive, clever, or always right, and start thinking about how you're making people feel. Are you someone who makes others feel lighter or heavier, more confident or more insecure, more hopeful or more cynical, more seen or more invisible? These are the questions that matter, because at the end of the day, people won't quote you, they won't remember your arguments, and they won't recall the specific advice you gave, but they will remember that you made them feel something, and that feel will either draw them closer or push them away. And it will shape not just how they remember you, but how they move through the world, because the feelings we create in others ripple outward in ways we can't always see or measure, but that doesn't make them any less real or any less important. Self-awareness is the ultimate psychological advantage. If there's one thing that separates people who are truly in control of their lives from people who are constantly reactive, confused, or manipulated by forces they don't understand, it's self-awareness. And this isn't some abstract spiritual concept or feel-good psychology. It's the ultimate psychological advantage. The single most powerful tool you can develop if you want to live deliberately, make better decisions, build healthier relationships, and stop being a passenger in your own life. The moment you understand your own biases, your triggers, your emotional patterns, your defense mechanisms, and the unconscious forces that drive your behavior, you regain control, not in the sense of becoming a perfectly rational machine, but in the sense of finally seeing the invisible strings that have been pulling you in certain directions. And once you see them, you can decide whether to follow them or cut them. Social psychology isn't just about understanding and influencing others. It's about freeing yourself from unconscious influence, from the social programming, the conditioning, the inherited beliefs, and the automatic reactions that have been running your life without your permission. And self-awareness is the first step, the only step really, toward reclaiming that autonomy. Most people go through life on autopilot, reacting to situations based on patterns they've never examined, making choices based on feelings they don't understand, and repeating the same mistakes over and over because they've never stopped to ask why they do what they do, feel what they feel, or believe what they believe. They think they're making conscious decisions, but they're not. They're being driven by unconscious forces, childhood wounds that haven't healed, societal expectations they've internalized, fears they've never named, desires they've never questioned, and identities they've adopted without realizing they had a choice. Self-awareness is a process of bringing those unconscious forces into the light, examining them, understanding where they came from, and deciding whether they still serve you or whether it's time to let them go. It's the difference between being lived by your psychology and actively living with awareness of it. And that difference is everything. Without self-awareness, you're vulnerable to manipulation, both from others and from your own mind. You'll fall for marketing tactics that exploit your insecurities. You'll be swayed by social proof, even when it leads you away from what you actually want. You'll follow authority figures without questioning them. You'll protect your identity at the cost of truth. And you'll repeat relationship patterns that hurt you because you don't understand why you're attracted to the same kind of person or why you shut down in the same kinds of situations. You'll blame others for your reactions. You'll justify your behavior without examining it. And you'll stay stuck in cycles of anger, anxiety, shame, or self-sabotage because you don't see the patterns. And if you can't see the patterns, you can't change them. But with self-awareness, everything shifts. You start to notice when you're being defensive, and you can ask yourself why. What belief or wound is being triggered right now? You start to recognize when you're making a decision out of fear rather than desire, and you can pause and choose differently. You start to see when you're adopting someone else's values, opinions, or goals instead of defining your own, and you can reclaim your autonomy. You start to catch yourself in cognitive biases, confirmation bias, the sunk cost fallacy, availability bias, and you can correct them instead of letting them distort your perception. You start to understand your emotional triggers, the specific situations, words, or behaviors that send you into anger, shame, or withdrawal. And instead of being hijacked by those emotions, you can observe them, understand them, and respond with intention rather than reaction. Self-awareness doesn't eliminate emotions or biases. It gives you space between stimulus and response, and in that space you have freedom, choice, and power. Self-awareness also transforms relationships, because when you understand your own patterns, you stop projecting them onto others. You stop expecting people to heal wounds they didn't create, and you stop blaming them for triggering feelings that were already inside you waiting to be activated. You start to see that the anger you feel toward your partner might actually be anger at yourself, that the criticism you're so sensitive to might be echoing an internal voice you've carried since childhood, that the need for constant validation might be covering a deeper belief that you're not enough. And once you see these dynamics clearly, you can take responsibility for them instead of making them someone else's problem. This doesn't mean other people are never at fault or that you should excuse bad behavior. It means you stop confusing your internal experience with external reality, and you develop a capacity to ask, is this about them or is this about me? And that question alone will save you from countless unnecessary conflicts, misunderstandings, and relationship breakdowns. Self-awareness also makes you far less susceptible to the social psychology principles that control most people, because once you know how they work, you can see them in action and choose whether to go along or resist. When you understand that repetition creates belief, you can question the messages you've heard repeated and ask whether you actually believe them or whether you've just been conditioned to. When you understand that social proof drives behavior, You can notice when you're following the crowd and ask whether that's what you actually want or whether you're just afraid to stand out. When you understand that authority silences independent thinking, you can catch yourself deferring to someone just because of their title and ask whether they've actually earned your trust. When you understand that fear is a control tool, you can recognize when you're making a choice out of fear and ask whether that fear is justified or whether it's just been implanted by someone who benefits from your compliance. Self-awareness turns social psychology from a set of invisible forces controlling you into a toolkit you can use consciously, both to protect yourself from manipulation and interact with others more effectively, ethically, and authentically. The path to self-awareness isn't easy, and it's not comfortable because it requires you to look at things about yourself that you've been avoiding, denying, or hiding: your flaws, your contradictions, your pain, your complicity in your own suffering, and the ways you hurt others even when you didn't mean to. It requires humility, because you have to admit that you don't have yourself figured out, that you've been wrong about things you were certain of, and that you're more influenced by unconscious forces than you'd like to believe. It requires honesty, because you have to stop lying to yourself, stop making excuses, and stop pretending that you're a passive victim of circumstance when you've actually been making choices, even if those choices were unconscious or driven by fear. And it requires ongoing effort, because self-awareness isn't a destination you reach and then you're done. It's a practice, a continual process of observation, reflection, and adjustment, because you're always changing, your circumstances are always changing, and new layers of unconscious patterns reveal themselves as you grow. But the discomfort is worth it, because the alternative is living in the dark, being controlled by forces you don't understand, repeating the same mistakes, and never fully knowing who you are or what you're capable of. The process of developing self-awareness involves several practices, and you don't have to do all of them, but the more you engage with them, the deeper your awareness becomes. One practice is reflection, taking time regularly, whether it's through journaling, meditation, or just quiet thought, to ask yourself questions like, why did I react that way? What was I really feeling in that moment? What do I actually want? Versus what do I think I'm supposed to want? What patterns do I keep repeating? And what might be driving them? Another practice is seeking feedback from people you trust, because other people can often see your blind spots more clearly than you can. And while feedback can be uncomfortable, it's also invaluable if you're willing to receive it without defensiveness. Another practice is learning about psychology, about cognitive biases, emotional regulation, attachment theory, trauma responses, and all the ways the human mind works, because the more you understand how people function in general, the more you can recognize those patterns in yourself. Another practice is therapy or coaching, working with someone trained to help you explore your inner world, uncover unconscious patterns, and develop healthier ways of thinking and relating, because sometimes you need an outside perspective and a structured process to go deeper than you can on your own. And another practice is simply paying attention in real time, noticing your thoughts, your emotions, your body sensations, your impulses, and your reactions as they happen, without immediately acting on them, and just observing them with curiosity rather than judgment, because that observation creates the space between stimulus and response, and in that space, awareness grows and control is reclaimed. Self-awareness is also deeply connected to freedom, because the more you understand yourself, the less you're controlled by unconscious programming, societal expectations, or other people's agendas. You stop living a life that was designed for you by your parents, your culture, your trauma, or your fears, and you start living a life that's actually yours, aligned with your values, your desires, and your authentic self, whatever that turns out to be. You stop needing external validation as much, because you develop an internal sense of who you are and what matters to you, and that internal compass becomes more reliable than any outside opinion. You stop being as reactive, as defensive, or as easily manipulated, because you understand where your reactions come from, and you can choose whether to engage or step back. You stop being as judgmental of others, because once you've seen the messy, contradictory, flawed parts of yourself, you recognize that everyone else is dealing with the same complexity, and that recognition breeds compassion, humility, and patience. Self-awareness doesn't make you perfect. It makes you human, consciously human, and that a far more powerful and fulfilling way to live than pretending to have it all figured out while unconsciously repeating the same patterns and wondering why nothing ever changes. So if there's one thing worth investing in, one skill worth developing, one practice worth committing to for the rest of your life, it's self-awareness, because everything else, Your relationships, your career, your happiness, your impact, your growth flows from how well you know yourself, how honestly you see yourself, and how willing you are to keep looking even when what you find is uncomfortable, because the ultimate psychological advantage isn't knowing how to control others, it's knowing how to understand and guide yourself. And once you have that, you're no longer at the mercy of unconscious forces, social pressures, or external circumstances. You're awake, you're aware, and you're finally free to choose the life you actually want to live. And that's it. 15 deep psychological truths that most people will never understand. 15 invisible forces that have been shaping your life without your permission, and now you've seen them all. You know how first impressions trap people in false narratives, how confidence is mistaken for competence, how fear controls more than any law ever could, how repetition creates belief even when there's no truth behind it, and how the need to belong can make people betray their own values just to stay inside the circle. You understand now that people don't protect truth. They protect identity, that power erodes empathy, that silence speaks louder than words, and that what people remember isn't what you said but how you made them feel. And most importantly, you've learned that self-awareness is the ultimate advantage, the one thing that separates those who are controlled by unconscious forces from those who see the game and choose how to play it. But here's the thing. Knowing all this changes nothing unless you do something with it. Information without action is just entertainment. And if you close this now and go back to living the same way you were before, then nothing will change. The patterns will continue. The manipulation will continue. And you'll still be reacting instead of responding. Still being influenced instead of choosing. Still living unconsciously instead of waking up. The real question is, what are you going to do now? Are you going to start paying attention to your own biases, your triggers, your emotional patterns? Are you going to question the beliefs you've been repeating without ever examining? Are you going to notice when fear is making your decisions, when social proof is leading you somewhere you don't actually want to go, when authority is silencing your own judgment? Are you going to start creating emotional experiences for others instead of just trying to say the right words? Are you going to protect your empathy even as you gain power? Challenge your identity when it stops serving you, and finally become the person who's awake, aware, and in control? That's on you now. This audiobook gave you the map, but you have to walk the path. And if you found value in this, if something here shifted your perspective, challenged your thinking, or gave you a tool you didn't have before, then do me a favor. Don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, leave a comment, and tell me which of these 15 principles hit you the hardest, which one you're going to start applying in your life, or which one made you see yourself or someone else in a completely new way. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's stuck in patterns they don't understand, someone who's being controlled by forces they can't see, because this information is too powerful to keep hidden. And the more people who understand how social psychology works, the harder it becomes for anyone to manipulate, control, or exploit us. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Bit-Size Book English. This is where we break down the most powerful ideas from psychology, philosophy, self-development, and human behavior into deep, no-fluff, real-talk content that actually makes a difference. No clickbait, no surface-level summaries, just the truth distilled and delivered in a way that sticks. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and make sure you're here for the next one, because we're just getting started. You've been controlled long enough. Now it's time to take back your mind, your choices, and your life. I'll see you in the next video. Stay aware, stay curious, and stay free. And thank you for listening.